Good evening and welcome to our last Writers in Conversation of the year. This is our reading series from the English department at the University of Southampton in England. And I am really happy to host you here tonight. My name is Carole Burns. I'm head of creative writing at the university. And I'm especially glad to be ending this academic year's series with a reading and conversation about an inventive new novel by our own Rebecca Smith, a principal teaching fellow in our department who teaches creative writing. Her novel, The Ash Museum, is published next week on the 3rd of May by Legend Press. And the book is an inventively structured, beautifully written exploration of 100 years of one family, the Ash family. The book travels from India in the 1920s to Surrey in the 1970s to Winchester in the noughties and circles back again to those places and times through a series of objects: a tennis racket, letters from India, an obituary, a bookmark, which evoke the experiences of members of the Ash family. The book does all this while at the same time managing to engage us in the lives of so many different characters and then catapult us to an ending. Yes, you can tell Rebecca teaches novel writing at our university. Well, I know Rebecca has been working on this book for a really long time. The novel has, I think, succeeded in capturing the zeitgeist of the political and literary world right now. Here is a novel that features a young woman working the fields in a tea plantation in India who is noticed by the white British plantation manager. Privilege and power are obvious here, though the writing is never didactic or messagey. Indeed, Rebecca's novel is full of love too, as it follows these two people's descendants who then become curious about their antecedents and her ancestors and what went before. All right, so I've carried away talking about this wonderful novel. Let me quickly mention a few things about Rebecca. This is her fourth novel. 3 others were published by Bloomsbury, and she's also published 2 nonfiction books, most recently the Jane Austen Guide to Writing. She is 5 times grandniece of Jane Austen. I must also add on a personal note that she is an absolutely fabulous colleague, supportive, inspiring, and I know how dedicated she is to her students too. So Rebecca, thank you for talking about the Ash Museum tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Carole, and thank you for all the kind words and having me on the show, so to speak. Thank you. Yeah, it's actually the first time I've spoken about the novel for a public event, so wish me luck. Yeah.
Good luck. I'm really looking forward to it. So we're going to start in a slightly unusual way tonight. We're just going to have you read the opening page of the novel. So we'll start there, and then I'll ask you a question about it.
Okay. Okay, the Ash Museum. Making the most of your visit. Welcome to the Ash Museum. On display are objects and letters telling the story of 100 years of the Ash family. The museum's collection is arranged across many floors and multiple rooms. You may not be able to see everything on one visit. Our guide offers a path through the museum that we hope visitors will find enjoyable and enlightening. If you wish to view the displays chronologically, i.e. in the order in which the objects on display were made or discovered, you will have to start elsewhere.
So I asked you to read that opening because I thought it was just so kind of bold and just so effective. When I read that last sentence that you just read to about 3 people over the phone when I was telling them that I was reading your novel and how much I was enjoying it. So do you remember how that very, very opening came about?
Yeah, I had the whole concept of the Ash Museum for a long time, although it went through various titles, but all with museum in them. And I actually looked at lots of online guides and real guides to art galleries and museums to see the sorts of things that they said. But I was thinking about really big art galleries, although the museum imagined in my novel, it's not a real museum, it's quite small. And I was just imagining all the different rooms and imagining a walk through a big art gallery, really, and how, you know, you might want to go and see the 17th century and then you might want to go and see the Impressionists or something. And I was aware all along that when I structured the novel that I wasn't just going to go chronologically, because I wanted to have things, I wanted the reader to see links between the characters and the things that happen to them and the way they behave, which are better seen when you don't see it chronologically. So I just wanted to say, hey, here is the museum, but it's not going to be chronological, really.
Well, it's almost, I almost wondered if it was kind of a, this is how I'm going to write this novel. I don't care what anybody else's think. And now I'm going to put this in the beginning of it. It just seemed very just kind of bossy and saying this is the way it is. And you know, and I really liked how kind of bold it was.
Yeah, it is quite bossy, and it's quite funny that you say that, because in my Brief Encounters module this week, I've been saying exactly to that bossy word about you have to beware of being a bossy authorial voice to the students, because readers will hate you for it. And here I am being a bossy authorial voice.
But this reader liked you for it. I liked it.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I guess.
Go ahead.
I guess maybe that means more when if you start telling people, you know, this is the moral of the story, or don't do this, kids, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
It felt like a narrator, not the author. So that's a difference.
Oh, good. Yeah. There is quite a visible narrator in it, in the way it's structured, because each chapter is named for an object. So there is a sort of a lot of intervention on the part of the narrator, and, you know, with the songs and things as well. Yeah.
And so you said that this idea of structuring a novel around these objects, which was a really gorgeous concept, I think, had been with you for a long time. Do you remember how that first came about?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's been done before, and there are, you know, novels like Pictures at an Exhibition, and novels structured around pieces of music and artworks and so on. But it actually, I kind of knew that I wanted to write this story, and then I was really lucky to be the writer in residence at Jane Austen's House Museum, and that was the thing that really did it. Getting to spend lots of time there and seeing the curator, who was then Louise West, at work, and telling the story through seemingly you know, objects which in many ways are insignificant, but then when you look at what they meant to the people who owned them and what they mean to us now, are anything but insignificant. And I had these boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of letters and photos and lots of books and stuff, and somehow wanted to make a story out of all this, but how to do that. And so looking at it through this way and being inspired by museum curators was really the way to do it.
And these boxes were from your own family history, which you've drawn upon for this novel. I think you had a couple of slides you were going to show us, and of some of these artifacts of your own. So
could we have the first slide, please? Yeah, so these are just some, and there really were hundreds, but I do want to stress that the novel's fiction. So these were starting points, but what happens in real life doesn't necessarily make the best novel. In fact, it generally doesn't. And I'd always been quite intrigued by my great-grandmother, who is Edith, who you can see in her wedding dress there, and then you see her two children, one of whom's my grandfather, the little boy, and then my great aunt holding his hand. And then the next one along is my great aunt when she was at Cambridge in the 1920s. And then that's Edith again at the end when she was an old lady. And she was utterly heartbroken because my grandfather had been killed in the Second World War. And so, but these were just some of the people. But so that's my great grandmother Edith. But if we could have the next slide, please. Yeah. And the photo that's actually at the very center of the book and that drives the plot a lot is this one that you can see of some Indian dancers. And what happens in the novel is that, God, where to start? So there is Josmi, and this is the fiction, and she's a dancer, and she also is one of the pickers on a tea plantation. They used to call them tea garden, but I just think that is, you know, such a euphemism, really. And she was married, in inverted commas, to my grandfather, who you can see on the horse, the second one there. And both of them died when my father and his siblings were very, very young. And it was that relationship that really inspired the novel. And so these orphan children, my father and his siblings, they were then brought up by the English side of the family. But I just wondered so much about my own grandmother, my Indian grandmother, about whom we really know very little. And I've just spent so much time wishing that I knew her, wishing that I'd met her, wishing that all this bad stuff hadn't happened, and also knowing that we had pretty much nothing of hers. But what I did find was this teeny tiny photo, and actually my cousin, who sadly died while I was writing the novel, told me that her mother, who's older than my dad, had said that my grandmother was one of these dancers, but we don't know which one. And the real photo is tiny. It's you could fit it in a matchbox. It's so small. But it's kind of this longing for this, you know, this lost grandmother, lost mother is one of the things that really drove the writing of the book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That photo is so intriguing in the novel, and it's also really intriguing to look at in real life.
Yeah. The real thing, it's so hard to reproduce it because it really is so tiny.
Wow.
But that is the only photo that we have. Just desperately sad.
Yeah. So, speaking of that grandmother, the fictional jazz, I keep forgetting on.
Josmi.
Is one of the point of views that you go behind in this novel, and I think you're going to read a few segments from her point of view.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to read. This is from. I mean, obviously, well, the story actually starts. If we look at it chronologically, it starts in 1912 in Canada when the Edith character, but she's called Emmeline in my book, when she's a young mother in Canada. And then we see some of that, and we see her son James goes to India to work for this tea company, and there he meets Josmi. And as so many English British men did at the time, lots of them would have these Indian families, really, and sometimes they abandoned them. Sometimes another woman, you know, the English person they were engaged to might come out and, you know, just basically take over. And lots of these children were cast aside. You know, the children of these relationships. But anyway, so here is Josmi when she catches the eye of James in the book. And I don't know if you can see that. Each chapter, I love the way Legend Press did it, and they've done it with these sort of this different typeface where it tells you what the exhibit is here. And the exhibit at the start of this chapter is photograph of some Indian dancers, mid to late 1930s. The first time Josmi saw him, she was just a girl. He had sat proudly on his horse, acting the Raja already, as her brother put it. And they all noticed his thick moustache that looked like a broom, or as though it had been made from the clippings of the horse's tail. He had thick dark hair, and he was brown from the sun already. He might soon look like one of them, except of course he was taller and heavier. He swung himself down from the horse and smiled at them all. Mr. Woods and Mr. Anders were there too. He said a few words in Hindi, and they all smiled and managed not to laugh. I'm very pleased to meet you all. My name is Mr. Ash. I am the new manager. Her uncle, who was quite senior in the garden, had stepped forward and replied in English that they would do all they could to make him welcome and assist him. Mr. Ash had looked very relieved. What had he expected? That none of them would be able to speak the language of the company? She watched as his boxes were unloaded and carried into his bungalow. That night he had looked so happy and content, sitting on his veranda and smoking his pipe and drinking a glass of something golden. They all hoped that he wasn't going to be a drinker like the last one, Mr. Campbell, who had pickled himself. He'd had horrible orange hair and skin that turned bright red. They'd heard that the company had sent him back to Britain or somewhere because he'd been too ill to carry on, or perhaps he'd fallen down drunk too many times, even for a Britisher. This Mr. Ash couldn't be much worse or more useless than him. Mr. Ash didn't notice her until she was older. She had just been one of the picker's children, destined to be a picker herself. If she hadn't been one of the dancers when some important British lady was visiting, he might never have noticed her at all. And then it switches to James writing a letter to his mother. James sat at the table on the veranda and began to write. The bungalow, Garden 1, Sonajuli, Assam, India. May 28th, 1936. Dear Mother, I thought you might like these photographs of Lady Hunsford's visit to the garden. It all went off very well, all very pleased with the way the garden was looking, workers content, dancing display, tea at club, etc. We had the children spell out welcome when she arrived, though you may not be able to tell that from the picture. That's the Bishop of Assam on the right of her, Woods and Anders standing behind. Also enclosed is one of the dancers. They were jolly good and went down well with all. James wondered if perhaps the visit might result in promotion. Everything in the garden had been running perfectly. The workers were looking happy. He had talked about how production was up by 1/3 since he'd taken over. He didn't mention that this was inevitable, as it had been so appalling under Campbell's management. Lady Hunsford had pronounced the dancers delightful. He stopped writing. There were, as usual, many things that he wouldn't mention to his mother. One dancer stood out, a girl of around 18, he supposed, whose limbs seemed more sinuous, whose fingers in the dance seemed so long and delicate, like the fingers of a harpist or some 17th century lady in a portrait. He imagined those fingers drumming on his back, those limbs entwined about him. He thought of the statues he'd seen in the temples. This was what men in his position did. He'd been here 3 years and had held out long enough. The day after the visit, he had asked for the dancers to be sent to him so that he could thank them for their performance. They waited a few feet back from the veranda. He spotted her at once. Yes, she was different. There was something that seemed luminous about her. Her skin more golden than that of her companions. Her cheekbones were higher. Her eyes were downcast. How old was she? Not too young, he hoped. He made a little speech about how well the visit had gone, thanked them all and gave them some money. Asked them all their names and how old they were, but he only listened to her reply. Her name was Josmi. She was 17 years old. He thanked them all again and dismissed them. But as they turned to go, he called her back. Josmi, would you remain here a moment? You others can go back to your work. They left. He knew that there would be nudging and giggling from her companions. He spoke to her in Assamese. "Do you speak English?" "A little, sir." He continued in Assamese. "Are you happy in your work as a picker?" "Yes, sir, we are all happy." "Are you married?" "No, sir, not yet." He saw her give a little smile. There was quite likely some arrangement made or in progress. He hoped it wasn't with anyone she cared for. "I'm looking for a housekeeper. I have my people who cook and clean, but there is room here and work for a housekeeper. You would earn more than as a picker, and you would live here in comfort with me. You'd have your own room, and the duties wouldn't be too onerous. Would you like to come and see? Shall I talk to your parents about it?" "My parents are dead, sir." "You could talk to my uncle or my brothers. My uncle is the letter writer. He taught me some English." "Very good. Come inside." Josmi followed him up the steps and across the veranda. She had never been inside the bungalow before. Her family's house would have fitted inside the first room. There was a large soft rug on the floor and so many chairs and sofas for just one man all alone. There were cases of books and a clock that was taller than she was. Why would anybody need such a tall clock? There were some dusty vases and a desk with its top open, papers and envelopes sticking out of the little drawers and boxes. There were photographs of British people, a woman, quite pretty, in an old-fashioned dress, like something a queen would have worn, and a stern-looking man with a beard. She guessed they must be his parents. In another photo, Mr. Ash and another British man and two British girls, one very plain, were standing in some hilly place, drinking out of small glasses. Another showed the plain British girl with her hair in two plaits coiled around her ears. In another, they were sitting on a rug with a big basket of food. The prettier one was smiling up at the photographer. She had light-coloured hair cut straight and short. "My sister and her friend in Cambridge," said Mr. Ash. Josmi smiled politely and wondered what to say. He led her into a room with a big table and uncomfortable-looking chairs. No wonder Mr. Ash was lonely if he had to eat in here all by himself every night. Pictures of places in Britain hung around the room. She would have liked to look at each one, but he led her on. The kitchen was also large and with more pans and things than anybody could need. "You cook well?" he asked. "My uncle and aunt think so. My cook is getting old. I think he could do with some help. His rooms are out there," he said, indicating across the yard with a jerk of his head. "Yes, sir." Only men worked in the manager's house. Surely he knew that. He showed her more rooms, a little one for storing food, another with sofas and rugs. "I don't come in here often," he said. She nodded. Imagine having rooms that you didn't need, that you didn't bother to even come into. Beyond that was a small room with nothing in it at all, just a low bed. A window with a blue curtain looked out towards the tea garden where she would normally be hard at work. There was a mirror on the wall with a dark wooden frame carved into a pattern of leaves. The glass was spotted with age. She caught a glimpse of herself in it. He was behind her. Their eyes met in the mirror. It was hard to judge his expression because his moustache hid much of his mouth, but then he smiled. "This could be your room," he said. "We could have other furniture moved in here if you wanted it, a dressing table perhaps." She found herself nodding. Did that mean that she had agreed? Did she have a choice anyway? "Let me show you the rest of the house." She followed him and saw 4 more rooms, 3 of them bedrooms. He had space for many visitors. The ceiling sloped, and because he was so tall, there were places where he wouldn't be able to stand upright. In a bathroom, there was a huge white bath. It looked so cool, and she stared longingly at it. His shaving things had been left out on the sink. She averted her gaze from them, but only after she'd seen the brush, which was stiff and bristly in shades of grey and white, and must have been made from the fur of some animal. She wondered if his moustache would look like that when he was older. She realised the last room was his bedroom. There was a quilt on his bed, and she couldn't help but walk over and look at it. It was made from many different shades and patterns of green and brown. Some looked as though they had been cut from the sorts of dresses British ladies wore, or from tablecloths or curtains, but altogether they looked beautiful. "My mother and sister and her friend made it for me," he said. "It's very pretty, sir." Around the room were shelves of books and more books piled up on the floor in every corner. He certainly needed somebody to dust and to try to put all of these books away. More photos lined the walls. In some, teams of men were lined up in rows wearing different sporting uniforms. In others, there were people from the other photos. In one, the lady who looked like his sister and the bigger lady were sitting on a bench that curved around a tree trunk. She realised that she was staring and backed away towards the door. None of the girls she knew had been inside Mr. Asher's house. She didn't know what she would tell them when they asked her about it. Going inside with him meant that she was different and that people would talk and treat her differently. She supposed that it was all very ordinary for a British man. It would make no difference to him. There, shall I stop there?
I feel like I want to pretend we're in the NST and clap for you. It's wonderful. It's great. So the two sections, first of all, we have two questions already, which we'll get to very quickly. And I encourage you all to send questions or even just say hi. If I put the note, put the word out on Facebook and reached out to a number of our MA Creative Writing alumni. And so even if you're just there and just want to say hi, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
So those two sections illustrate one of the other things that I love about this book, and that is how distinct the voices are in your different points of view. We all know that's supposed to happen when we change point of view in a novel or a story, but you actually succeed in creating their personalities through their voices. Can you talk about how you went about that, and if some came more naturally than others?
I have always loved writing from different points of view, and apart from a few short stories, I've always used what we call third person limited because I just think it's the most fun. God, how do you do it? I guess I spent a lot of time imagining. And I did a lot of research in terms of reading loads of books about the tea industry and history books. It was helpful having lots of the family things in terms of some letters that my grandfather had written back and that had been written to him and somehow saved. And I guess, how do you do it? I guess thinking about the language was really difficult in a way because I had to, for the book to be readable to a reader of English, I had to put all the language, all the spoken words into English, which I don't think they would have been actually. I read lots of memoirs and books written, sort of obscure diaries and things written by people who had lived on, these were generally white people's point of view, written by people who'd, been wives of tea planters and so on. And there have been some good novels and memoirs and things from the point of view of children of these marriages between Indian women and the white tea planters as well. I don't think that's a very good answer. I think it's just all about imagining, really. Yeah.
Well, that's what strikes me as you imagine so well it would be like for this woman who was a field worker in the tea plantation to be in this house called by the manager, and how she would see that room in a completely different way from how he saw it. And that's one of those little details. And then these little bits of her personality that sneak out in the middle of what is otherwise a kind of describing what she sees. It's really great.
Yeah, and she was offered this, and I don't actually know that much about my real grandmother, so I was just trying to imagine what it was like being the character in my novel. But imagine going from a hut that's quite likely made of corrugated iron to a bungalow, with fans and a bath and all these lovely furnishings. I mean, yeah, so I mean, it's and how much choice did she have? But my own grandparents seemed really to have been very happy, and things were actually quite different in my family. You know, my grandfather, he didn't keep things secret, so my great grandparents did know about the children before he died, and so on. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you now.
There we go.
Yeah.
Sorry there. I pulled out an external mic because I understand we were getting some feedback. So I'm hoping maybe that will improve that quality to you there wondering what I was doing here. One of the descriptions that I love from this novel is when you have her look at photograph of the person who ends up being Lucinda, and she describes her that she looks like her face looks like a dish of yogurt. It's just such a wonderful, like unusual description. It was just perfect. So I want to, well, shall we hear from your next point of view, and then we can get to some of these questions. We have so many, we have a lot of questions already from some of our lovely students. So, but why don't you go ahead and read another section from the book?
Okay, and next time when you're talking, I'll mute my mic, and you know, if we keep remembering to do that, maybe that'll help. Right, yeah. So partly because I was hoping lots of my students would come, what I thought I would do was read a kind of student bit, because the novel then it follows Jay, who's the son of Just Me, and then it follows Emmy, who is Jay's daughter. And so Emmy is the granddaughter of James the tea planter, and Just Me, also, you know, from the tea plantation. And in this section, Emmy is now a student at Southampton University, and I just thought it would be quite fun to read a bit. It's 1986, and she's going to a student party and is going to have an encounter, which at the time actually seem that significant, but as the novel goes on, it will be more significant. And the museum artifact for this chapter is replica World War II flying jacket, brown leather, circa 1986. He was known as Seb's Soviet worker. This was a time when regular young men didn't work out and gyms barely existed, but Seb had a set of weights in his room and got up early to go rowing. And when he wasn't rowing, he was running or caving or rock climbing. Apart from the rowing, he wasn't that into team sport. Individual attainment of perfection was his aim. He had the profile and big arms of a man on a Soviet tractor poster. Despite his nickname, Seb wasn't left-wing. He described himself as apolitical. It was the 1980s, and CND badges were becoming rarer on campus. Stock Sock was the fastest growing student society, and pearls and braying were widespread. Emmy had felt as though she was the only person not to be excitedly trying to buy BT shares. Seb had a growing portfolio, but it wasn't something that he discussed. He had a slick of fair hair that he pushed upwards and backwards, while the short back and sides were always neatly clipped. He wore a brown leather flying jacket. Emmy longed for a jacket like that. She could imagine the weight of it around her shoulders, the silky lining, how cool it would look with a pretty little skirt, but he never lent it to anybody. She had never spotted a girl or a boy wearing it, or indeed any of his jumpers, the way girls wore the big jumpers as trophies of whoever they were currently entangled with. Look at me, I'm wearing his jumper, and don't my wrists and collarbones look thin coming out of it? Seb was friendly and charming with the easy confidence of the expensively educated. But it was his perfect profile, chiselled cheekbones and huge arms that earned him his nickname. He was in most of her lectures and some of her tutorial groups. But there's no point in hoping. There must be dozens of girls in love with him. And now here he was in a crisp, creamy white shirt, a silky white pilot's scarf. It was the sort that people wore with a tuxedo. Black jeans and that jacket. He didn't look uncomfortable in the jacket, even though it was boiling at the party, and the room was thick with Christian Dior poison and smoke. Talking heads were playing. Seb wasn't dancing. He was standing there, not like Mr. Darcy, but smiling and holding a bottle of pills. In pubs, they all drank pills or Grolsch, until they all drank Sol, with pieces of lime stuck in the top. But at this party, other people were drinking cheap wine, bought by the hosts on a day trip to France, or cans of horrible cheap lager. So how come he had a pristine bottle of pills in his hand? So I'm just going to take a little sip. So how come he had a pristine bottle of pills in his hand? Emmy hated those bottles of pills. It was impossible to hold one or to have one on the table in front of you without starting to pick at the label. The result was always an ugly mess. They looked nice when they were studded with diamonds of condensation, but the moment someone started picking at that label. A girl with long, pale brown hair was dancing a crazy dance in a corner with her eyes closed. She was wearing a pale blue Laura Ashley blouse with a big pie crust collar and jeans. Emmy suspected that she had been a born-again sixth former, and now at university was becoming an unborn-again student, and was busy losing her religion. Emmy pretended not to be watching her. There must be a crucial time for first years from Christian families, she thought, a point at which they had to decide whether to enrol at the Christian Union and get up early for church on Sundays, or to leave their Bibles in a suitcase under the bed and to not put up any posters with sunsets and messages and to just try and blend in. Emmy's paper cup of wine was empty. She moved towards the kitchen. The corridor, like the corridor of every student house she had been in, was dark because the bulb had gone and nobody would buy a new one. There were couples snogging already. Emmy looked away. There were couples snogging already. Emmy looked away and glanced up, noticing the pretty plaster coving and the ceiling rows that would be yellow with filth and smoke, and felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Seb, Soviet worker, was smiling down at her. You aren't going already? Just looking for some wine. I'll come with you. The light in the kitchen was bright. The floor was sticky with spilt lager. Somebody had made some food, but as there were no plates or forks, nobody was eating it. Or perhaps they wouldn't have anyway. Some loaves of French bread had been cut into circles and spread with something brownish. Wafts of garlicky steam were coming from the oven. Emmy suspected that there was some forgotten garlic bread in there, but a couple was so engrossed in each other in front of it that she didn't want to interrupt or intervene. Their clothes and hair would stink the next day. There was a wheel of camembert with a cigarette stubbed out in it. Plebs, said Seb. Emmy agreed, although she wouldn't ever have said plebs. The centrepiece was a huge glass bowl of wholemeal pasta salad. It was coloured green with what Emmy suspected was mint sauce and decorated with peas and leaves of mint. Nobody would eat it. How sad to think of some girl going to all that effort of making it, only for it to sit there in its ridiculous greenness. Emmy felt like chucking the whole lot into the open bin bag in the corner now, just to save the poor girl having to do it later. She had come with Ian and Anna. Ian was in a class with one of the boys in the house. Emmy didn't know them, but judging from the names on the unfunny quotes board, there were some people who lived here called Katie, Sophie, Phil and Cy. Wine, Seb announced. It was Liebfrau milk. I don't think you should drink that. Let's see if there's anything better. What about you? He patted his jacket, and Emmy heard a gentle clink. Brought my own. She disapproved of people who did that, who brought a bottle and then hogged it, though it did make perfect sense when other people brought such appalling things. Perry or lager that was only 1.5%. She had once seen a guy put out a top deck limeade and lager and put it down on the table and then help himself to some Carlsberg that someone else had brought. This looks better. He poured her a paper cupful of Suave. So, Annie, he said, why don't you ever talk to me after tutorials? Why do you always hurry away? It's Emmy, said Emmy. Do I? He put his finger under her chin and tilted her face up towards him. Emmy is pretty. Prettier than Annie. Much more unusual. Boys don't usually use the word pretty, said Emmy, and no boy had ever used it about her name before. Emmy is sweet, Emmy is cute, Emmy is graceful. Was he laughing at her? It's Emmeline, really, after my great-grandmother. He had a strand of her hair curled around his finger now. Not the Emmeline Pankhurst. Oh no, but the same generation, said Emmy, thinking of the portrait of Emmeline in red above her aunt's fireplace, and the photographs of Emmeline in her wedding dress with the velvet ribbon choker. Who would want to wear something that tight around her throat for her wedding? His finger was running along her clavicle now. Emmy was secretly vain about her clavicles. His finger slipped under the necklace of black jet beads she was wearing. Aunt Lucinda had given them to her. Emmy smiled. It was as though her great-aunts and her great-grandmother were with her at the party, hovering somewhere behind her. What would they be saying? They must have been to parties, though probably not ones like this. She couldn't imagine Aunt Margaret gulping wine from a paper cup whilst being seduced. Emmy shifted her feet. She felt that she had to move them every so often to stop them from sticking permanently to the floor. The jet beads were coiled around her finger now. She hoped he wouldn't twist them any tighter and risk breaking the string or choking her. They're Victorian, she said. My great-aunt gave them to me. You aren't in mourning, he said. Last week's tutorial had been on Mash's role in The Three Sisters. Only for my life, said Emmy. Actually, I'm not at all. She smiled. Life was taking off. The suspected Christian renegade came dancing in and started swigging from the bottle of Libra milk. Seb and Emmy's eyes met, and they laughed. God, it's dreadful here. You were clearly made for better things. Shall we go? He smiled down at her. Would you like to come home with me? Okay, said Emmy. She found her Mac in the heap of coats over the banister. Anna was sitting on the stairs, talking to a boy Emmy vaguely recognised, some third year in theatre sock. I'm going now, Emmy told her. Anna grinned and raised her eyebrows. Emmy gave a little shrug and blushed. They made a quick exit. It was easier to talk to him walking along in the dark. It was drizzling slightly. Emmy hoped her hair wouldn't go crazy. She reached into her Mac pocket for her faithful velvet scrunchie. Soon they turned the corner into Osborne Road, a dead end. Along here, he said. It was the last house. It was all in darkness, no working light in the hall, of course. She was just able to navigate her way around the two bikes, big racers, so boys, that almost blocked the hall. She skidded slightly on a free newspaper. The house smelt pretty dreadful of damp and bacon and mud. There must be some rugby kit mouldering somewhere. Perhaps Seb didn't live a life of perfection, whatever his hair might suggest. Shall I stop there?
Thank you. That also shows off one of the things that I like about your writing in this book. You are very slyly funny and occasionally a little bit evil in how your characters describe people. And I really loved that she was secretly vain about her clavicles. It's just a wonderful little moment. All right, we have many questions and I would like to get to them. So we have two questions from Costas, and I'll ask the second one for now, and if we have time, we'll go back to that first one. And the second one is there any particular piece of advice that you regularly offer your students that you find yourself disregarding more often than not? But don't forget to unmute yourself as well. Oop, you need to unmute you.
No, of course not. What a ridiculous question. I think actually one thing that I don't do that I do get students to share their drafts sooner than I would share my drafts. But that's probably it, really. I think that's all really. No, I do try and tell the truth as much as possible.
Well, sometimes we don't know is better. It is good for us to do, right? Sometimes we don't do that, but anyways, so the first we have two hellos I'll share. Hello, the Southern Tribune. Our team is looking forward to reading this. And then another hello, good evening, cousin. Lovely to see you.
Oh,
I hope some
who's
of our
that?
escapades are included, Paul.
Oh, I'm afraid not actually, Paul, because although it's based on some real things, actually what works well in fiction is not often what happens in life. And I mean, I'm really lucky to have 2 sisters and a half sister and a half brother and loads of cousins. But Emmy, my character, and also Jay, it actually makes a much better novel for them to have not to have lots of family, because as Kurt Vonnegut says, you know, be a sadist and keep making terrible things happen to your characters. And if she had had lots of nice cousins and siblings, there just wouldn't have been such a story, really. She needed to be lonely, and Jay needed to be lonely for the story to work. So, sorry.
So question 3 from Rosie is, hello, is such a fascinating background to the novel. I'm wondering what you will do with all the boxes. Have they been indexed? It sounds like they'd make a fascinating exhibition to go with your novel.
Well, actually, because I started out with lots that my cousin gave me, and then my cousin, by lots, you know, a stack, you know, sort of shoulder high. And my cousin had done a pretty good job of putting things in order. And then very sadly, my cousin died just very suddenly when she was only in her late 50s. And it transpired that she had left me all the papers and boxes in her will. So we drove over and got them, and they filled the whole of one room. And it was really fascinating in many ways. But I just thought, oh my God. And here was 100 years or more of family papers. And the best thing to do was to give them to someone else. And so I went through them with Sarah, my sister. And luckily for me, Hampshire Records Office wanted it. So it's all at Hampshire Records Office now, because they were interested in people who were from Hampshire, and the people who hadn't been from Hampshire, where the stuff was, because they were Austen descendants, they were interested in that too. So I'm deeply grateful to Hampshire Records Office. So that's where it all is now.
That's great that that someone is valuing those even after you've written this novel.
Yeah. But I mean, I kept some things, like I kept quite a lot of photos, and I kept some things that I didn't think people would want to go to Hampshire Records Office, you know, more recent things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So hello from Charlotte, by the way. I was absolutely entranced in your narrative as you were reading the characterization.
Oh, thank you.
So a question from Helen. So lovely to hear you reading your book. I wondered if you thought about including pictures of your objects in your story.
Well, I really wanted to, and I did talk to Legend Press about it, and I could really imagine having pictures, and it would have been delightful. But it was difficult because some of the objects were real, but a lot of them I just made up for the story. What they did do, which I really liked, was, and where I did have some of the real things like postcards, you know, we debated, or we could actually put this picture of the postcard in, but there were just so many that they didn't want to. What they did do, which I really love, I don't know if can you see that black dot? So one thing that they did do, which I really liked, was so that it's like an interactive museum. Every so often it tells you things like, press this button to hear Ella Fitzgerald singing these foolish things. So there's some of those in the book. There's quite a lot of things like lists, and there are some things like when there's a fete early on. So there's a leaflet from Ottram Village Fete, and then there's another one later on. So I was really pleased with, and the letters are sort of set up. I don't think you'll be able to see that, but the letters are sort of very set out like letters. So we sort of got close, but not I don't think they would have had the budget for the illustrations, although I mean, I would have loved it, but no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was a newspaper article which looked very convincing as well and read very convincingly, like the obituary I was thinking of. That was really well done too, another found object.
Yeah, those were actually real. The newspaper article is actually real, and that was in the Times. And the obituaries were very close to ones that I found of my grandfather, but I changed them a bit.
Right, right. Okay, a question from one of our students, Tom. Your descriptions are so precise and humorous. What's your method around being so vivid and accurate? The stubbed out cigarette in the camber there tickled me. I'm going to turn my light on. It's looking a little dark. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, so I think editing and editing and editing endlessly. One of my main aims in writing is just to be as clear as possible. Clarity is always a really big aim. So I guess aiming for clarity, cutting as much as I can, but I do love objects and visual things. And I mean, our house is kind of full of stuff because of that reason. And having the objects in it, it really made writing the book a lot easier. And I also tend to always think in terms of scenes as well, so that, you know, and just really picture the scene and picture the backdrop and picture, you know, what's surrounding the characters and what they'll be doing with their hands. And I think lots of writers are sort of frustrated painters, really. I mean, I'm terrible at painting and drawing, but it would be much more fun to be an artist, I think.
It would, wouldn't it? But I'm terrible at it also.
Yeah, but I'm not complaining. I mean, charmed life. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So we have a hello from one of our English colleagues, Stephen. We're not supposed to say surnames here, but he says, greetings, and the novel sounds great. I'll be ordering tonight. I believe our hosts have a link to October Books and PG Wells that they're going to put in for us for people to pre-order. And also a note from one of our MACW graduates, Karen. Hi, both, and congratulations, Rebecca. Hello, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from an alumni and book blogger, Charlie. I couldn't be more excited to read the Ash Museum. How do you find the motivation and discipline to write each day? Is there a time of day you do your best writing?
Charlie, thank you. And I was really excited to see that you're part of the book blog tour, so thank you. The truth is I don't. I should. I mean, this is the bit of advice that I give my students that I don't do. If I wasn't working, then I would write every day. And yeah, so this is where I fail in terms of not doing what I say. What I have learnt to be very good at doing is when I do have time, of being able to get into it straight away. So I am good at using what sort of parcels of time I have got. And I always, when each new term starts, if I've been really busy writing, I always think, oh, you know, what's the big deal? Just carry on writing. But actually, one tends to be so busy with work that it doesn't really happen. But when I'm not writing, I will always be reading and thinking and making notes and jotting down odd things. So that's where I fail, really. And this book did take a really, really long time. Although, I mean, I did other books along the way, but it did take a very long time to do.
One thing I wanted to ask you is you know, to my knowledge, this is the first time you've written about your heritage, and I'm wondering what prompted you to write this book now.
I guess, I mean, it was always something that I was really interested in as a story. And I think in a way, each book we do is kind of a reaction to the book that goes before. If you think about the order of, I mean, not that I'm comparing myself to her, but of Austen's novels, you know, how she'll do one heroine and then she'll do another. And I think I wanted to do something on a big scale, first of all, having done novels that were very, you know, tight time frame of just a year or a summer and so on. And it appealed to me to do something that was 100 years. And I had always just been absolutely fascinated by people in pictures that the family had. And also the book's actually dedicated to my dad. And as he's got older, he has got a bit happier to talk about things. And so my dad did help me with it a bit in terms of, because a lot of the stuff that happened to him was really tough and really sad. But as he has got older, he has got a bit more happy to talk about things. And I guess it was just one of those stories that I just always wanted to write, and becoming more and more, and I suppose having one's own children as well. And I mean, there's always so many reasons for writing a book, really. And also my two beloved great aunts, who actually died quite a long time ago now. But people who've read my other novels will see that these sort of great aunt figures do keep recurring. And I guess I'm just really interested in the things that people inherit that they know about. And I don't mean stuff, I mean sort of traits and likes and dislikes and ways of seeing the world. And the things that they may have inherited that they don't know about. And I have very strong suspicions that some of these things would be inherited. And I could see huge similarities between myself and one of my great aunts, who there is a bit of a portrait of her in the book. So I guess I was just really interested in tracing those lines of inheritance, really. And also looking at things like inheritance of, you know, sort of how loss impacts down the generations, those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's all of that is very, very present in the novel. You can really, you've succeeded in doing all of those things. It's great. Yeah, and it's interesting, as the reader of the novel for the fictional family, the reader knows everything. Emmy doesn't know what we know about her grandmother, for example. And that's kind of one of the fun bits of fiction. So we have a hello from Bridget, who also has a question, but before her is a question from Amber. Can't wait to read this. What do you use to help your writing process when plotting your setting in the world within your novel?
That's a really interesting question, actually, because a lot of it is, I mean, is set in countries that I haven't even been to. But then those bits are actually set back in time. So it wasn't as though I could go back in time. I used so many books and also the internet. Very bad book buying habits, but also using interlibrary loans at the university library, to reading just everything I could, whether it was about the flora and fauna of northern India, and you know, reading stuff about wheat in Canada. But I did also have diaries and letters that really helped, and I looked at Google Earth too, which actually made me realise I've made some mistakes with the terrain, and so I had got some things wrong about where I'd set some of the India bits. So I had to change some of those, and it really mostly reading. I know that's not a terribly reading, photographs, maps, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so our question from Bridget is, do you write beginning to end? Or do you work on chapters as you get inspired and then link them together later?
This novel very much was done as a patchwork. I didn't write it chronologically, although the first bits I read were actually, the first bits I wrote were the earliest bits in 1912, because that just sort of seemed to make sense. But I tend to just write the bit that I feel like doing, but I'll sort of do it in chunks. So I would spend quite a lot of time doing the 1980s, and then I might go back and do, lots of 1930s or something like that. And it wasn't till I was quite far on in the whole process that I actually decided on the final structure of what was going to go where, and those decisions were made on kind of thematically. So if I wanted readers to see the links between characters from one bit to another, or characters going through similar things, although of course they didn't know they were, and that influenced the structure, but also having to think about the way that information was going to be released to the reader. So because it is, and one of the things I'd wanted to do was, how on earth do you capture 100 years of a lot of people in different countries and get that into a novel that will be satisfying? So I had to think about how I was releasing the information to the reader in a way that would sort of keep progressing the plot, and hopefully have enough suspense to keep people reading and have them keep discovering things. But there's a lot of dramatic irony in it too, where, of course, the reader knows stuff that the characters don't know. So, but no, I don't. I tend not to write chronologically. I just write the bits I feel like writing at the time. And I think that's quite helpful, because it will then, you're going to have to go back and edit a million times anyway. So writing non-chronologically will help you to think of the bits that you need to go back and do and to change.
Yeah, I also do that. I couldn't possibly write the beginning of a book.
No.
Just so I think it really isn't. Your book reads. It's not at all difficult to follow all the decades and places and different characters. You've really done a marvelous job of that. And I think the way you kind of grouped little sections from one person's point of view in one time period before going to another one for a while, that we stayed with each one for maybe 20 or 30 pages, or maybe longer probably. I think it was a smart decision. That was great. Okay, we have a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. I'm a fan. A question from Helen. As someone who feels like it's going to take forever to write my book, I'd love to know what is a, quote, really, really long time.
10 years. Yeah, about 10 years. But I did do other books along the way, and I kept setting aside. I did a novel for children that's coming out later this year, and I did 2 non-fiction books. So if I had just done this one, it would have been quicker. But I hope I will never spend as long on a novel again, because it just began to feel like an albatross. It really did. So when Legend Press wanted it, it was a massive relief, because of course I was thinking, have I wasted 10 years on this complete folly? But you can only write the book that you sort of want to write, I think. But the one I'm doing now, I hope to get done it'll be less than 2 years, but it's going to be something with a much smaller scope.
Oh, do you want to tell us about
it? Yeah, a little bit. It's a seaside setting, and I think it's each book being a reaction to the others. More comedy and quite a lot of murder, really. But I'm sort of going back to something that I've done before. It's got quite big environmental themes as well.
So you're hitting the zeitgeist again with the environmental themes.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, but lots of stuff about the sea. The trouble is I always take so long to do things so with the Ash Museum, when I started writing it, it was before the BBC had done all that history of the world in 100 objects and all that stuff. But now objects are old hat. Or old hats are objects.
Both. So we have two earlier questions, but I'm going to ask one from one of our, a second question from one of our undergraduates, Tom, because it seems essential for the third years right now. I'm currently at the rewriting and editing stage of my dissertation. Any advice regarding this? Nothing worse than having to delete a line you've become attached to.
I think the thing is, the reader doesn't know that that line you take out was once there, so they're not going to miss it. My general advice is, if in doubt, take it out, and I would get someone else to read it for you. I mean, obviously your dissertation supervisor, but also your friends, and they can often help you to make decisions about which bits can really go. And very often you might find you've got two lines that are doing the work that just one line can do. And I think every single word, every single sentence, every single everything has got to have a function there. And if it doesn't, it should go. And you do have to be really tough with yourself. And I think the other thing to do is you don't have to throw those lines away forever. So sometimes one has a really great joke, but it's just not going to fit in this particular story or scene. And, you know, cut it, but put it into another document. And then you can always use it later.
It's easier to cut if you do that, I find.
Yeah, because then you don't feel you're throwing stuff away. And I think one thing that's hard for students is because when they have these word counts and they're sort of racing to meet the deadline, so they sort of write 500 words and then they're loath to throw away that 500 words because I've done 500 words. But sometimes it's better to.
Yeah. So I want to remind people we have a few more minutes left if anyone else wants to ask a question. But in the meantime, I'll go back to an earlier question from Costas, which was, he was wondering whether your teaching has influenced your creative writing and your creative writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. It has made me, I hope, a much, much better writer. I have read far more about writing than I would have otherwise. I feel like I learn a lot from my students, undergraduates, MAs and PhDs. I think the way that one has to, I mean, I say has to because it's part of the job, to be reading a lot of drafts and giving advice on work, it really helps you to be a better editor of your own work, and also to be less, kind of less precious about your own work as well. So I tend to find if an editor says to me, something can go, I tend to just think, yeah, okay, fine, you know, unless, you know, because they know what they're doing. It also, with students, particularly like Costas, I read stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have read, you know, his reading suggestions. The conversations that one has with them about writing and about reading and books. And one thing that is, I mean, it's just such a complete joy to be working with other writers and working with young writers. And not so much in this book, but I know in my next book, it's for an old person like me, it's just nice to be around young people as well and all their, you know, just to be a tiny part of their lives. And also writing is such a lonely business that, and this year has been really hard for everyone. And I'm really missing my students. And I think just that getting out of the house, talking to people, being in rooms with nice people talking about books, you know, it's a real tonic. So it's not just what one learns, but it's also, you know, the sort of important things for life as well.
Yes, all that energy that comes back at you in the classroom.
Yeah.
We miss you guys.
Yeah, and one thing that's just given me intense pleasure about this is one of the people who's quoted on the back is one of my students, Ella, and that just has, I guess you can't actually see it, but it is Ella, and it just has such a, nothing makes us happier than our students' own success. You know, whether it was a student, you know, everything from, you know, when they work on the story and get a fabulous mark because they've done so much work, or they win a competition, or their book is published, you know, it's just brilliant. Yeah, and part of me thinks, oh, my work here is done. You know, that's it, I can retire now.
So we have 3 new questions have come in. So one from Jack, one of our undergraduates. In terms of the writing process, do you have a specific routine, place, or setup that works best for you?
I always start longhand when I'm starting work on something, and I think the actual act of writing in a big A4 notebook with lines is very freeing and actually much better than writing on the screen. And I think I'll do that even more over the summer, just because I know everyone's eyes are just practically falling out from a year of screens. And then I will tend to go from the notebook to typing up. And then once I reach a sort of critical stage with the novel, I will just be writing straight onto that. But in terms of daily routine, I find I work best first thing in the morning. I'm pretty useless writing in the afternoon. I guess everyone has that sort of, you know, siesta time. And sometimes it picks up a bit in the evening, but morning is the best time. And I think the best thing to do is to do it before any of the concerns of the day can sort of start pressing in on you. And that's the sort of, for me, the sort of golden time of writing. Or I'd say don't check your emails before you start writing, and you'll get a lot more done. I know lots of writers will have a laptop, and it's harder to do this now, but that's not tuned into the internet just to get lots of stuff done. Because it's so easy to think, oh, I'll just look this up and, you know, all is lost. Or I'll just answer one email and, yeah.
Absolutely.
I do set myself word counts as well. You know, I start thinking, okay, I'm going to just 1,000 words a day, or, you know, 500 words a day. And that really helps too.
Great. So we have a question from Abby, our MA Creative Writing alumna. Very nice to see you, Abby. Hi, Rebecca. I have a lot of half-written things and find it very hard to finish anything, and motivation ebbs and flows. How do you know when it's the one to stick with, other than a gut feeling?
You have to, well, yeah, I was going to say, but that's a gut feeling. I would say work on short stories because they're so satisfying to write, and force yourself to finish one. I know that's hard, but do something like look for a competition to enter, or a journal to submit to that's got a deadline, and make yourself do it for that. I'd say also be part of a writing group. And I know one thing that MA students often miss when they finished is that having to do your homework thing. And loads of writers, really successful writers who've published loads of books, are part of writing groups. And if you are meeting up with your writing group, then you've got to do your homework, you know, for them. So, because you've got to do something to take along. So I think give yourself deadlines, even if they're artificial, whether it's to enter a competition or for your writing group or something like that. And also be kind to yourself, because, you know, if you've got a busy job or if you've got kids, you know, it's really hard. It's much easier when you're an MA student if you're not doing loads of other things as well, or when you're an undergraduate. So you could sort of concentrate on doing flash fiction, for instance, and then sometimes you only need to write 30 words, but I mean 30 very good words. But I think the satisfaction of finishing something is always a good, it helps spur you on to finishing other things too. Yeah, so I'd say be kind to yourself and try and write shorter things, but also have some form of doing your homework or entering things.
Yeah, and I remember, Abby, you were writing a lot of nonfiction. So, you know, writing short essays, personal essays are, I think, you know, in right now, there are a lot of venues for those. So that's another option related to Rebecca's idea of finishing something you'll feel so accomplished. Question from Isabel. I think that's another one of our creative writing MA graduates. What a treat to hear you read. Having invested so much time and research into your novel, at what point in the writing editing stage do you stop research?
The answer is actually never. And I was still changing stuff. I had the proof, and having thought that I had checked everything under the sun, I realised I had just always imagined the house where James and Josmy live as having an upstairs. Of course it didn't have an upstairs, it was a bungalow in India. And at proof stage, I guess I think I was just carrying on looking at things, looking at photos, reading books. At the very proof stage, I had to quickly go back and change it so it didn't have an upstairs. And then great embarrassment, I'm the Academic Integrity Officer for English this year. And my editors should have picked this up too, but I realised on the very, very last stage, you know, sort of practically with hours to go, that I had all these chunks of Auden in it, not out of copyright. And I had to quickly go back and paraphrase that. So I am hugely perfectionist, and I do end up checking things a million times because I'm so worried I'll have made mistakes. And I would just carry on watching films and reading books and reading more novels all the time. So I do a mixture of researching as I go along, and then you just stay quite immersed in the world of the novel. So basically never. And even now I'm still worried I've got stuff wrong.
Well, it's fiction. That can always be your excuse. So one last question from Charlotte, and then I'm going to ask the final question, I think. From Charlotte, how did you decide which objects you were going to use in the Stories Museum?
Do you know, I don't think I actually thought about it hugely. They just sort of came to me, and I guess they came out of the scenes that they were all in. So I definitely wasn't sort of thinking, oh, what object shall I have for this? I guess because I was thinking of, in terms of the unfolding scenes, it was just going to be some key object in that. Although sometimes the object is just it sort of happens to be there. Because I wanted it, one thing I've always been interested in is the randomness of things in museums. And Emmy, the character in the book, does actually go and volunteer at this rather rubbish museum. And you sort of look at things that are in museums and wonder why they've survived to be there. And sometimes they might have survived because no one even liked them. When I was at Jane Austen's house, they had this wonderful handling collection. They still do, with things that people could go and, you know, basically play with, and you'd use them for creative writing things at the museum. And some of them were pristine objects like kid gloves. And you would think, has this never been worn because the person hated it? Maybe they didn't fit. Maybe they saved it for best and that best day never came. And I did want it to be I wanted it to be a sort of eclectic museum with some things that are exhibits that might not be exhibits in a real museum, you know, like the broken tennis racket. And I kind of wanted it to be, in some ways, the detritus of people's lives in a way, but also the things that endure. And I mean, archaeologists know the reason we have a lot of pottery in, you know, in museums of archaeology, is because it endures. And so I guess I was thinking in those terms as well.
Great. Actually, I'm going to go back. There's one more question from a student, from Rosie, that I wanted to ask before I ask my question. So, and her second question was, are there any orphans in the novel or characters that experience kinship care, i.e. living with a family member rather than mother or father?
Yes, absolutely, Rosie. So what happens is that, I mean, it is a lot about orphans in that Jay and his sister Molly, who are Josmi's children, first of all, their father dies at Kohima. He's the tea planter, and the English family steps in and basically takes over these children, and they're sent away to this boarding school. And then Josmi dies while they're away, and they never see her again. And then the English family takes them over. So they're orphans, and then when they are teenagers, they come to London, and I'm giving stuff away here, and they live with Lucinda, who isn't actually their aunt, but who is the best friend of their real aunt. So yeah. And then, and I was very much wanting to write about loss and you know, how loss echoes down the generations. And then Emmy herself, her mother dies when she's very young too. Well, she's a teenager as well. And so it's just Jay and Emmy together. So yeah, there is loss and orphans, yeah.
Rosie, I don't know. I think the Ash Museum might end up in your PhD, maybe. I think it could.
Oh no, I don't think so. I mean, it could do, but yeah.
Well, the last question I wanted to ask is that obviously this is a book that relishes books themselves. It mentions so many books. It mentions 1001 Nights, The Secret Garden, Northanger Abbey. Aunt Margaret gives Emmy Howard's End for Christmas one year. And there's also a beautiful evocation of The Great Gatsby at a very important moment. Aside from just the fun of doing that, what were you kind of playing around with there?
Well, a lot of it was to do with who the characters are, because apart from James, the tea planter, who mostly reads books about mountain climbing and stuff like that, one of the things that the characters, most of them, inherit from each other is their love of reading. And I've got two librarians, and also, I mean, you can see, I think they're mostly contemporary books behind me. But one of the reasons that I felt like I could get to know some of the ancestors of mine is having inherited so many of their books. And you can just tell so much about people from the books. And so I could see that my great-grandmother had been buying E.M. Forster's novels the year they were published, so clearly was a really big fan. And in her diary, she'd recorded what book she'd got for her children for Christmas. And so you can sort of see their lives mapped in books. And Emmy goes to university to do English. And I also wanted to show, particularly between Emmy and her Aunt Margaret, this really strong similarity between the two of them. And they are both librarians, but Emmy's a librarian at somewhere rather like Portswood Library, whereas her Aunt Margaret was an academic librarian. But I wanted to sort of show how these sort of bonds of reading and love of books are some of the ties that are binding them.
Great. Well, Rebecca, it's been fabulous. It's been fabulous to hear about your novel and to talk to you about writing. And thank you so much. I'll have to be the alone applause. I can clap really loudly if I need to.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much, Carole, for inviting me. And thank you to Aisha and to Thea, who are behind the scenes. And thank you to everyone for coming along. And I'm sorry if the feedback was annoying. But, I am doing...
Go ahead.
I am doing another event next week. It's actually on the 6th of May, and it's at the absolutely gorgeous P&G Wells bookshop in Winchester. Again, it's online because we're not allowed to have big events, and it's really nice to do it there because it's a bookshop that some of the characters would have gone to.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone would like to come to that, then I would love it if you came. And I'm going to make sure it's really different, or as different as possible, you know, different readings, different questions, stuff like that. But then the equally gorgeous October books in Southampton are also stocking the book. So if you are going to be kind enough to buy it, then if you could get it from one of those, that would be fab.
Yes, that's great. And you can pre-order the books at both places. And I can highly recommend it. It's really wonderful. So let me add to thanking a few people for an entire year now of Writers in Conversation. Aisha Jahan has been such a tremendous support, come to every single one and been in the background, making me much less nervous because I know she's there. Taya has been helping out this semester. Sylvia Lanati from the Peru Public Engagement Research Unit has been fabulous. And Peru has in general been really supportive of Writers in Conversation this year, supplying this lovely StreamYard technology for one. And in the second semester, I had 4 marvelous BA interns helping. I'm not supposed to say last names, although I want to, but I will say Tom and Jack, who are graduating this year, and Angie and Ben, who are second years. A special thanks to you. I also want to brag a little bit about Jack, who's been accepted into the MFA program in creative writing in the New School in New York City. So that's exciting, and we'll be bragging about you at away days, I'll have you know. So, so we'll be back next year, hopefully in person and online. We're going to try to find a way to use StreamYard while we're hopefully in person in rooms. So all of you can watch our YouTube page or our Facebook page for news about this. So let me also just call out a few of the wonderful alumni and students that we've seen today. Abby, it's great to see you. And Gabby, I haven't mentioned your name yet. Charlotte and Costas and a few current, there are just so many of you there. It's just fabulous for you to be here. So I think that's everything I wanted to say. So Rebecca, once again, congratulations on this beautiful novel. And thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks.